Tonight.
Do you need a deputy out to your house?
They are trying to break into my house, please.
A mystery begins with a desperate call to 911.
They're just looking, okay. Ma'am?
That 911 tape was a real-time audio recording of the event.
Investigators and forensic experts race to piece together the clues.
Things were not adding up.
Could a man sworn to uphold the law have broken his vows?
He told her, put the gun down and shot her.
In the early morning hours of August 25th, deputies from the Harris County Sheriff's Department were dispatched to a home in the affluent Houston suburb of Old Oaks. They were serving a third-degree felony warrant to a 42-year-old divorcee, Susan White.
Seconds later, 4176, shots fired, need an ambulance, officers are not injured, suspect's been shot.
The Harris County DA sent Don Smith and Edward Porter to the scene to begin the investigation.
On August the 25th, 1992, Edward and I were dispatched to this residence here to investigate an officer-involved shooting which Harris County Sheriff's deputy had shot and killed the homeowner, Miss Susan White.
That deputy was 27-year-old Kent McGowan. He had been with the Sheriff's Department for nearly 2 years.
When they arrived here, Deputy McGowan indicated that they saw a light coming from the window here. They came over, they used flashlights attempting to look inside to see if there was a person inside and if that person would answer the door. They didn't get a response. They came back, knocked on the door. Susan White came and answered them, talked to Deputy McGowan, indicated that Deputy McGowan should leave her property, that she was not coming out as long as Deputy McGowan was on her property.
When it became apparent that Susan White was not going to let the officers in, McGowan contacted his supervisor to get permission to make forced entry.
He was basically asking me for absolution to kick the door in on a felony warrant. So, of course, I told him, I said, you have a felony warrant in hand, don't you? Yes, sir. I said, well, kick the door.
McGowan went around to the back door where they already had Malloy stationed. He instructed Malloy to kick the back door to make the entry. On the fourth kick, the door came open, the alarm went off, and McGowan entered with his gun drawn.
I went first. Opened the door, I went in and I entered the den. All white, crossing the bedroom door and had something in her hand. I was giving us a gun. But I know they deal with it. We ran across towards this point of the house. I have a flashlight in my left hand and my weapon in my right. She was sitting on the edge of the bed pointing the gun at me. I yelled twice, I said, drop the gun, drop the gun. And she came up with a gun just like this. I yelled the third time, I said, drop the gun. She was shooting us on fire.
Everybody was kind of the impression there's no problem with this or executing a felony warrant. She was armed. He told her put the gun down and shot her. You look at it and you think, well, it sounds good.
I can remember thinking to myself, well, there's a gun on the floor, and this seems to agree with the idea that someone in this room has threatened the officer with a gun.
Initially, investigators thought it was a justified shooting, but within hours, they began to ask questions.
The first thing that struck me as strange about this shooting incident was that McGowan had had some prior contact with Susan White, the deceased. Miss White is a middle-aged lady in a very nice house, and that she pulled a gun on him.
More doubts were raised as investigators continued their walkthrough of the crime scene.
McGowan says he proceeded across through the breakfast room to the entry between the breakfast room and the living room.
Right at that entrance, he says he sees Susan White to his right, moving over to the left and entering a room.
McGowan then says he follows Susan White to her bedroom.
When they started running down the things about how they enter this dark house and He runs across the room. That's when it starts setting the bells off with me.
Jason, Susan's 17-year-old son, was sleeping upstairs when officers broke down the back door and proceeded into the house. Officer McGowan claimed Jason was dealing guns.
When we came up on the scene, we're trying to find out who the vicious gun dealer involved in this is, and we see in the back of one of the Sheriff's Department cars this young man, I think he was 16 or 17, but he looked like he was 12, in a pair of boxer shorts, shivering in the back of a car. And, you know, you're going, this is the guy that resulted in you going to get a warrant and coming out here to kick a door in the middle of the night to arrest his mother?
I heard 3 shots. From automatic pistol. I got on the phone with 911.
11 County, what is your emergency? Is this your house alarm or car alarm?
My house, and I heard the shots going off.
You're hearing what?
I heard the shots. Pow, pow, pow.
And I saw flashlights around my door frame. 10 seconds after I heard the 3 shots, 2 officers came upstairs to my room, opened the door, and I was in my boxers, in the bed, sleeping. They said, get on the ground, get on the ground. They had their pistols drawn at me. They rushed me outside, put me in the back of a patrol car, and I said, where's my mother at? Where's my mother at?
When we return, investigators begin to reconstruct the crime and discover a chilling 911 call.
She was on the phone at the same time the back door was kicked in and the alarm went off.
On August 25th, 1992, just after midnight, Deputy Kent McGowan arrives at the home of Susan White with a warrant for her arrest. What should have been a routine procedure turns deadly when Susan White is shot. Deputy McGowan claimed he fired at White in self-defense. But all of this comes into question when investigators discover a frantic 911 call made by Susan White on the night of the shooting.
911 County, what is your emergency?
Deputy McGowan here at my door. I filed several complaints with him for sexual harassment, and I need some help immediately.
What is going on now?
There's a man standing at the door. He said he's a policeman.
He's at the front door or your back door?
Right. McGowan has made sexual advances toward me.
Okay, what else is going on?
Who's there? Get McGowan away from my house. I want him out of my yard, off my property.
Do you need a deputy out to your house?
They are trying to break into my house, please.
What's your address?
347 Amber Forest.
Who's breaking into your
I
house?
don't know. They say they are detectives. I have been threatened by one of them.
Okay, what's your name?
Susan White. Lieutenant Jones is the one I need to stop with. They're breaking my door.
What's the name of your subdivision?
Old Oaks.
How many is there?
I don't know. They please.
What are they doing?
They're just broken. Okay.
Ma'am?
To me, the biggest break in the investigation occurred at 4:30 in the morning when we got that 911 tape where we had Susan White, get somebody else out here. I don't want McGowan out here. He's been sexually harassing me. It's just chilling when she said, help. That 911 tape was almost a real-time audio recording of the event because it has Susan White on the 911 tape calling the Sheriff's Department for help. You hear the door get kicked in and hear the alarm go off. Then you hear her, after about 6 seconds, hang up the phone.
And to the police, that 6 seconds becomes crucial to the investigation.
We attempted to determine how long it would take somebody to, from the time the back door is kicked open, to get to that bedroom. We timed it and learned that you could get to that back bedroom within that 6+ seconds.
To investigators, what seemed unusual about McGowan's story is that he ran directly to the bedroom, disregarding his law enforcement training.
When you're doing a hard entry on a house, you have your weapon up, aimed, and you are very precise in your movements. You're clearing every corner, making sure that somebody's not hiding in a corner with a gun.
She had purchased a pistol, a little .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol that was chrome, the gun that she held when she was shot that night. When McGowan just took off and went straight to her bedroom, she could have been standing behind
this doorway over here. She could have been up this stairway. She could have been over here behind this bar hiding, waiting to ambush whoever came in.
If you were a cautious police officer and really fearful of somebody going to commit retaliation on people, do harm to other people, you wouldn't just run blindly for the bedroom.
With mounting suspicions, Assistant DA Don Smith did something he had never done in his entire career. He concealed a tape recorder in his pocket and recorded McGowan's version of what happened that night.
Everybody discounts a hunch, but there was one of those that I just wanted to make sure that we got everything down that he said, that there wouldn't be any question about what he had told us during the walkthrough, and make sure it wasn't any difference than what he put in his written statement that he would give later on that morning. That's why I used a tape recorder. In all of the officer-involved shootings that I've investigated in 10-plus years, I never had recorded an officer during a walkthrough, either before or since.
Edward Porter and Don Smith continued their walkthrough as Deputy McGowan led them up to the final moments before he fired his gun.
I was leaning in the doorway like this. Deputy Lloyd was standing. He was right behind me somewhat.
McGowan followed her to her bedroom. McGowan stops at the bedroom door.
She was kneeling down. I said, "What is doing?" I said, "It's left in the right." Knock on the brow. And I said, "You got a gun." I said, "Drop the gun, drop the gun."
McGowan says that when he gets to the doorway, he sees Susan White starting to kneel and sit on the bed with a gun in her right hand. McGowan says he raised his gun at her and told her to drop the gun 2 times.
Well, the second time I was to drop the gun, she came up with the gun and I parked the gun.
When Edward and I finished the scene investigation, we didn't say a word to each other. We just both had this uneasy feeling. You know, and I told Edward, go to the hospital, find out what you can find out. By this time, we knew she was deceased, but go look at the wounds. The wounds tell you a whole lot about how things happened.
When we walk away from there that night, McGowan ran up behind us and thanked us for coming to this justified shooting. I mean, I remember thinking that if ever the hair on the back of my neck stood up, it did then.
When we return, a new question is raised. Was Susan White having an affair with Kent McGowan, or was it a case of fatal attraction? The investigation at 3407 Amber Forest Drive in an affluent Houston suburb has intensified with the discovery of a 911 tape recorded the night Susan White was shot by Deputy Kent McGowan. The next crucial step in the investigation was to look into McGowan's personal and professional history. Born in 1965, Kent McGowan grew up the son of a wealthy Texas oil man and rancher. At the age of 17, McGowan graduated from high school, joined the Air Force, and married his high school sweetheart. Catherine Casey, author of the book A Warrant to Kill, followed the investigation for years and reveals her insights into McGowan's personal history.
His marriage with Michelle had always been very troubled. He was never faithful to Michelle that I know of. There was always another woman.
In 1989, Michelle filed for divorce, but they were remarried several years later. That same year, McGowan joined the Houston Police Department. As part of the investigation, Steve Clappert looked into McGowan's law enforcement record and found it to be fraught with problems.
I pulled his personnel file and I saw all the problems that had occurred in there. There was a number of instances where there was accusations of violent acts, assaults on prisoners, and numbers of disputes with other officers, including several female officers that he had been dating.
Teresa Curry, a sergeant with the Houston Police Department, worked with McGowan in the late 80s at Houston's West Side Station.
There was a female officer that I worked with that at one point in time he pulled a gun on her and put the gun to her head and threatened to kill her.
An investigation into McGowan's behavior caused him to resign from the Houston Police Department in January 1989. He then attempted to return a year later, but was required to undergo a psychological evaluation prior to being rehired.
That psychological evaluation told the police department in no uncertain terms they should not rehire Kent McGowan, that he was certainly not police material and would not be a good candidate for rehire.
In an exit evaluation done by the Houston Police Department, Assistant District Attorney Don Smith recalls a chilling response made by one of McGowan's supervisors.
Should this guy be rehired? One of his supervisors said, no, never. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but I do remember that, he will kill somebody one day.
After failing 2 psychological evaluations, McGowan became an unpaid reserve officer with the Tomball Police Department in May 1989.
There came to light that he was investigating a major Colombian cocaine cartel in Harris County. He puts out that they've got a hit on him and they're going to kill his family. Well, investigation showed this wasn't anything like that. Ultimately, McGowan was fired, and so Joseph McGowan applies with Harris County Sheriff's Department. They review him, they see HPD, don't know how, but the Harris County Sheriff's Department hired him. What they should have been looking at is what we call tramp cops. And these are guys that go from agency to agency to agency. First of all, you don't leave an agency like the Houston Police Department, that at the time was the highest paid in the county, and go down to another agency where you make less money, and then go to another agency where you make less money. Those should have been some flags.
In April 1992, Kent McGowan was assigned to street duties with the Harris County Sheriff's Department as a contract deputy, patrolling the Old Oaks neighborhood.
During this time is when he first met Susan White. And it was obvious then that Joseph McGowan was attracted to Susan White. The type of ladies that he liked were blonde, flashy cars, tall, thin.
Susan was just a really bubbly, happy person. She took acting classes. She took Jason to do acting classes. She did a little modeling job here and there whenever she could get one. She had a lot of fun. If she could get a little bit part in a picture, she'd do that.
In 1985, Susan met her 3rd husband, Ron White. They moved to the affluent Houston suburb of Old Oaks with her teenage son, Jason.
She really wanted it to work out. She had tried with Ron White. He was her 3rd husband, and she was very, very disappointed when that marriage fell apart.
It was under these circumstances that investigators believe Susan White met Deputy McGowan.
Was there a relationship between Joseph McGowan and Susan White? From all indications, there was. The relationship involved him stalking her.
Kent McGowan had a history of locking into women at vulnerable periods in their lives. He'd done this before. He could initially come off as being incredibly charming. He catered to women. He was also the type of person who was very impressed with money. Susan White was living in the big house. She had the white BMW. She had the clothes. She looked great. Susan White that summer was not interested in a long-term relationship with anybody like Kent McGowan. She told another man that she had a brief fling with that she'd had a one-night stand with a cop and that cop wanted more, and she wasn't interested. And I very much suspect that one-night stand had been with Kent McGowan.
She told me that this Kent McGowan had come to her house and was trying to be a little more friendly than she was prepared for. Susan said that every night almost he would stop by there and knock on the door and start making conversations. He done his normal stuff, if you take care of me, I'll see that Jason don't get in any trouble.
My mother had mentioned McGowan quite a few times, like the encounters at the mailbox when he drove up and told us she had beautiful legs and he wanted to take her out.
It got to where she was becoming hysterical about this guy, and she would tell me things, and then she was scared. She was petrified of him. She was terrified of him, and he threatened her son, and she's a very protective mom.
Several weeks prior to Susan White's death, she sought advice from an acquaintance, Captain C.J. Harper of the Harris County Sheriff's Department. She went with Ray Valentine to speak with him over dinner. After Susan's death, Captain Harper came to the district attorney's office with some revealing information.
Now, Susan White approached Captain Harper, and when she was introduced to him, said to him, "I'm having a problem with an officer, Deputy McGowan." He's been sexually harassing me, bothering me, coming over. What do I do? How do I handle it? What should I do? And that Captain Harper told her, you need to call Internal Affairs and make the complaint with them.
This represented a serious threat to McGowan's law enforcement career.
For someone who really needed that badge and that gun to feel like a man, this was a terrible affront. This was the most horrendous thing that could happen to him. He might not be able to be a cop.
As investigators tried to unravel the relationship between Deputy McGowan and Susan White, they discovered a bizarre sting operation.
All of a sudden, boom, there's this concoction. Jason Aguillard, Susan White's son, an 18-year-old boy, is a major arms dealer. And he tells his supervisors, oh, we have this major arms deal here, and I'm going to go make an undercover buy. I've got a guy that can buy a pistol from Jason Aguillard right now.
3 days prior to Susan White's death, Jason's best friend, Mike Schaefer, became McGowan's confidential informant and agreed to help McGowan set up Jason to be arrested. On August 23rd, Mike Schaefer met Jason and a friend to buy a gun. Jason was acting as an intermediary in the transaction. It was Jason's friend who actually sold the gun to Mike Schaefer.
At that time, I saw a wrecker approach us from behind. Kent McGowan jumped out of the wrecker in plain clothes and ran up to us, and that's when all the squad cars came rushing in.
Jason and his friends were taken down to the substation, where Jason began to have suspicions about Mike Schaefer's involvement with McGowan.
The officers had Xerox copied money, and I was assuming that the police officers had to give Mike Schaefer the money.
Prior to the sting operation, McGowan had given Mike Schaefer $200 to purchase the gun. He Xeroxed the money so they could trace the serial numbers.
When you hold up the Xerox copies of the purchase money, it doesn't take long for someone to figure out the police gave that money to Michael Schaefer for the purposes of purchasing it. And it becomes rather clear to anyone who's paying attention that Michael Schaefer is the CI.
Jason was held at the station overnight, but was never charged with gun possession.
He never could pin the gun charge on me because I never had it in my possession. They never found the pistol on me. They never saw any interaction or change of hands with a pistol from me or Mike Schaefer.
Deputy McGowan had used this information and put out this information that Jason Aguillard, Susan White's son, was selling drugs, conducting these wild parties, selling automatic weapons, involved in burglaries and lots of criminal activity. He was using this in order to get to Susan White, whether he was going to try to force her to be his friend or whether he was just going to punish her for rejecting his advances.
When we return, investigators uncover a web of lies and deceptions that gave McGowan a warrant to kill Susan White. On August 25, 1992, in a Houston suburb, Deputy Kent McGowan shot and killed Susan White while serving a felony warrant. Investigators discovered that 3 days prior to Susan White's death, Deputy McGowan arrested her son, Jason, in a sting operation, along with his best friend, Michael Schaefer. Michael was acting as a confidential informant for McGowan.
This was the incident that precipitated the retaliation charge. This is where everything came from. This sting led to Susan White calling Michael Schaefer's mother.
Susan White says, I think there's a confidential informant involved, and you know, that's bad business. Confidential informants don't live long. I'm trying to find out where Michael is. I need to know what the story is, why Jason is arrested.
That evening, Michael Schaefer paged McGowan, expressing concern over the phone call from Susan White.
He says to McGowan, Susan White has talked to my mother and has talked about a CI being involved. And she said that CIs just don't live long. And this is worrying me because people are going to find out. I'm afraid someone might do something to me. And McGowan says, you've been threatened. Don't you understand? Susan White has threatened your life. I can go and arrest her for that.
Kent McGowan painted a picture of Susan White as being a gun-toting moll and as Jason for being the head of this dangerous gang. And he repeated this to both of the assistant district attorneys he spoke to that night in order to get the warrant for her arrest. It was a lie.
As part of the investigation, we wanted to determine whether or not the arrest warrant for Susan White was valid. So we went and got a copy of it, and then based on the copy, we were able to go interview the prosecutors that were involved in writing that probable cause affidavit.
I started working that night at midnight. I replaced Gene Hughes, who had been working from 5 in the afternoon. Going to be coming in wanting to get me to write him a warrant for retaliation.
A retaliation occurs when someone threatens a witness in a criminal case.
McGowan told me that a young man by the name of Michael Schaefer had been threatened by Susan White.
She was such an international drug runner that she said to me, this is kind of humorous, and there's nothing funny about the whole incident, she said to me, "Ray, what size bullet does this little gun wear?" Like it was a dress. That's how knowledgeable she was about firearms. Never fired one in her life, to my knowledge.
McGowan was just absolutely insistent that she was truly a danger to Michael Schaefer, and that was one of the things that motivated me to go ahead and write him the warrant that morning.
No one said we were scared that Michael was going to get killed. And for retaliation, it really kind of needs to be a serious threat and one that you believe there's probability to be carried out.
I ultimately learned that a lot of what McGowan told me was untrue, that there really wasn't a gang of kids out there running guns. There were no Uzis. There was just one gun that anyone could ever find out that I'm aware of, and it was just a handgun.
If you're in here executing a bad warrant, then we're looking at a murder charge.
Despite mounting evidence against Deputy McGowan's claim of self-defense, he found strong support in the Sheriff's Department. One of the greatest challenges investigators faced was breaking through the impenetrable blue wall of silence within law enforcement agencies.
In the Harris County Sheriff's Department at the time, it was a very close-knit group, and I mean, it was hard to penetrate that shield, but there were cracks in that shield.
Officer Al Kelly, who worked in the same department as McGowan, knew Susan White from his neighborhood patrols. He would eventually testify against McGowan.
The last time that I had spoken to her, she told me that he was harassing her, sexually harassing her, and that she was scared of him. When I told Deputy McGowan to be careful with Susan because she was scared of him, he said, "I'll kill that bitch."
Sergeant David Ruggiero, who was McGowan's supervisor, recalls another incriminating statement made by McGowan about Susan White.
Something prompted McGowan to say, "Can you believe that crazy bitch?" or something to that effect. I was just infuriated. I was furious. And he apologized, saying, "I'm sorry, you're right, I'm just my adrenaline." And right then and there, I knew he just sold me another used car. He was telling me what I wanted to hear.
Investigators were stunned to learn that McGowan played Susan White's 911 tapes to fellow officers. McGowan's former co-worker, Officer Jeff Copeland, gave investigators the details.
Kent went into the sergeant's office, and several other deputies joined him in there, and they played the 911 tapes. Kent was very proud of the tapes, kind of leading everyone, "Oh, this is when I did this is when I did that." He was kind of laughing and kind of yucking it up, having a good time with him.
He had been bragging about the shooting. And McGowan told Jeff Copeland, anytime you kill somebody, they collect the shell casings and they mount them on a plaque, and they give it to you like a trophy.
I've been a cop 25 years, and I've never heard of such a thing.
He hasn't killed some terrorist with an AK-47. He hasn't killed a hijacker in the commission of a felony. He goes in and shoots a 42-year-old woman in the bedroom, and he's down here bragging like he has saved the world from crime.
As the investigation intensified, crucial evidence was revealed by ballistics experts. Steve Clappert, a veteran investigator with the district attorney's office, set up a forensic reconstruction of the crime scene to see if McGowan's story rang true.
Well, I always like to do bullet paths, find out if everything comports with what the story was that the officers were relating to us.
I was leaning in the doorway like this. Deputy Moore was standing. He was right behind me somewhat.
There we go into the bedroom. These are the door jambs that he indicated that he had took refuge behind when he encountered her pointing a gun at him. This is the controller box on the TV where his bullet had passed through the corner of the controller box and into her body. We lined this up with another bullet strike on the head of her bed, passing from this hole here into the wall. This is a steel tape that we used. We ran across through the corner of the controller box and on out of the room. It's just a straight line. There was nothing to interfere with that bullet path. Once this bullet is launched, it's going to remain in a straight trajectory, and that will give you an approximate height of where the weapon had to be fired in order for these strikes to have occurred in that order. He would have had to have been 10 feet tall in order to have fired the rounds that struck her.
Based on the trajectory report, it was clear to investigators that McGowan was not standing in the doorway as he claimed he was when he shot Susan White.
He would have had to advance into the room probably 5 feet in order to achieve that angle at his height, because it's just scientifically impossible to hold a gun in front of you and to fire and have that bullet land exactly where it landed.
When we return, the autopsy report reveals crucial evidence in the investigation of Susan White's death. Investigators had serious doubts about Deputy McGowan's claim of self-defense in the shooting death of Susan White. McGowan's co-worker, Officer Jeff Copeland, then revealed a powerful piece of evidence about how the shooting occurred. Specifically, the order of the bullets when McGowan shot Susan White.
He told me that he shot her. The first shot was to the head, which blew the side of her head out, and the second and third shot was to the body.
With this new piece of evidence, investigators began to examine McGowan's assertion that Susan White was sitting on the bed pointing a gun at him.
She was sitting on the bed, she had a gun pointing at me like this. You know, I yelled her twice, drop the gun, drop the gun. And she raised up like that, and she was shooting fire.
Armed with the autopsy report and the knowledge that the first bullet hit Susan White across the bridge of her nose, Assistant District Attorneys Smith and Porter examined the trajectory of the bullets to determine the position of Susan White's body when McGowan shot her.
He got a wound through the right arm into the chest. He's got another wound into the chest from right to left at a downward angle. And then you've got a third wound that goes across the bridge of the nose. There's no way you're going to get a bullet that goes across, cutting the bridge of the nose, breaking her glasses from right to left if she's looking at him straight ahead. It just doesn't happen that way. So that meant her body had to be in a different position.
Susan White was in profile when the first bullet struck her. She was facing him when he shot her.
Her head has to be toward the middle of the bed and low to get the trajectory of that bullet coming across from the converter box to the headboard. So the position of her body has to be somewhere across the bed, completely opposite to what Deputy McGowan claims. The position of Susan White in a seated position, pointing a gun directly at Deputy McGowan is just impossible.
Investigators were now convinced that Susan White was not sitting on the edge of her bed, pointing a gun at McGowan. His story takes yet another blow when investigators interviewed Susan's family.
This policeman, McGowan, was saying that this was self-defense and that Susan had a gun. So I don't know why, but my first question was, what hand was the gun in?
McGowan said and demonstrated how Susan White raised the gun and pointed it toward him with her right hand.
I said, no. I said, Susan is very left-handed.
She plays golf with the left hand, plays tennis with the left hand, drinks coffee with the left hand.
What I think was in her hand was probably a telephone.
With all the forensic evidence, prosecutors were armed with enough information to charge McGowan with murder. In February 1994, Deputy Joseph Kenton McGowan went on trial for murder in the shooting death of Susan White.
At the first trial, one of the most amazing parts was that this thin blue line absolutely snapped, and one after another, I believe it was 8 officers got on the stand and said Kent McGowan was not to be believed.
In the case of Kent McGowan claiming self-defense, it appears that it didn't fly with the jury, because once they determined that part of his story is untruthful, then they have less reason to believe that the critical part, that is, I fired my weapon because I was afraid she was going to kill me, that is, Susan White was going to kill me. Once they decide that the rest of his story is a lie, their reason to believe him on that issue is substantially diminished. And apparently they did not believe him.
In March 1994, Kent McGowan was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But to the shock of the jurors, McGowan was eligible for an appeal bond.
The jurors at the first trial didn't know that Texas had a law at the time that said that in any trial, any felony trial, anyone who's given 15 years or less is eligible to be out on an appeal bond while his or her case is going through appeal. So if they had come back with a judgment of 15 years and 1 day, Kent McGowan would have gone immediately to jail. The fact that they came back at 15 years meant that he was automatically eligible for an appeal bond. He was granted the appeal bond, and he didn't have to go to jail until the appeals were settled, which turned out to be an incredibly long period of 8 years.
In February 2000, to the shock of Susan White's family, the appeals court reversed McGowan's conviction because of a technicality. The case would have to be retried. When we return, investigators discover a shocking confession in the secret diaries of Kent McGowan's lover. In March 2002, 8 years after the shooting death of Susan White, Kent McGowan went on trial again for murder. District Attorney Edward Porter prepared the case for retrial and called a surprise witness to the stand. McGowan's ex-girlfriend, Summer Edwards, revealed the secret diaries that she kept while she was dating McGowan during his first trial.
If he would have knocked at my door and had a sign across his head, it said, "Hey, I'm a murderer. I killed a woman in cold blood. Now, I'd like to come move in with you and your daughter." Well, I think I probably would have said no. But he didn't. He proceeded to tell me he was wrongly convicted and he was set up. He came across with flowers and romance and "I love you and I'm going to take care of you."
As the romance intensified, Summer began to grow suspicious.
I found him sitting on his bed in the master bedroom with his head in his hands, just pounding his head into his hands and just cursing and swearing and slurring and saying some things that I really couldn't make out. I said, "Susan White, is that who you're talking about?" And he said, "Yup." And he had this kind of strange, bizarre look in his eyes. And at this point, we were talking about getting married. And I had to ask him, I said, "Did you really mean to kill her?" And he said, "Yup." I said, "Why?" He said, "The effing bitch needed to be killed. She was effing with me. She wanted to get me fired. And she was going to call my wife."
After McGowan's confession, Summer made an alarming discovery.
We were looking for some toys, and I just happened to be looking under the king-size bed there in Kent's bedroom, and there were some photo albums, and it was pictures of dead people, bloodied, murdered, shot up, severed heads. I mean, just the most disgusting pictures you've ever seen. And I said, "Kent, why do you have these?" And he said, "Because they're cool." And I jumped up and ran to the bathroom and was sick to my stomach.
Convinced of McGowan's guilt, Summer Edwards went to the police and testified at his second trial. In March 2002, Kent McGowan was convicted a second time for the murder of Susan White and was sentenced to 20 years in prison.
I don't like it. I think it should have been 99 years without parole. That's the way I feel. My entire family feels like that.
Joseph McGowan is a rogue cop. He's always played fast and loose with the rules. He's been in trouble every place he worked. And then he commits the ultimate crime while he's wearing a badge. I mean, he shamed everybody in this agency that wears that badge.
He didn't kill a dope dealer. He didn't kill a rapist. He killed a confused middle-aged woman who was scared out of her mind, and I wasn't there for her. And she died. I'll take this to my grave.
I feel hurt, depressed. It's been 10 years, but it's still hard. Every once in a while, it's hard to talk about it. Some days I can, and some days I can't. I'll lay in bed sometimes, and I just think about it, and I'll just break down, or it's hard to deal with.
It's been, a long time to get justice about old McGowan, but they should have given him death, but they didn't, so we got to take what they gave.
I don't think there's a day that goes by we don't talk about her. Something about Susan comes up. And my whole family just loved her.
Joseph Kenton McGowan is currently incarcerated at the Daniel Unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. To this day, he claims he is innocent.